Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Nijoni Nez, and I will be responding to Jordan Riley's debate on Prompt 3 of our national security debates. The topic of this debate is whether Israel should or should not continue its military campaign in Gaza, despite world condemnation. Although Mr. Riley made an excellent point and laid out a concise discussion, I will offer my rebuttal in opposition. Mr. Riley began by discussing the tragic attack on Israel by Hamas on October 7th, 2023. Now, there's no denying that the attack was horrific, but we can't lose sight of the broader picture that there was a human cost on both sides. The last thing we want to do is disregard the suffering of the Palestinians who lived under blockade occupation for decades. The violence that has swept through Gaza is not isolated, but a part of a larger cycle of retaliation, oppression, and retribution. If we focus only on Israel's victimhood, we might run the risk of ignoring the deep injustices faced by the Palestinians, whose land had been taken and whose rights were denied. While Jordan acknowledged the historical complexity of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, we need to be able to objectively look at the situation in a way that is fair to both sides. The military campaign is not merely a defensive act, but one that caused widespread destruction, death, and displacement among the Palestinians. That is why the idea of self-defense cannot justify the indiscriminate bombings that harm civilians like women and children and the elderly. The scale of destruction in Gaza harms innocent civilians, not just Hamas. Collective punishment of an entire population is illegal under international law, and Israelis' right to self-defense does not extend to violating Palestinian rights. The fact is that a peaceful resolution to the conflict can't come through military escalation. Moving on, we have to acknowledge that the action of Hamas may be violent, but it does not count towards defining the entire population. It's essential to keep in mind that not all Palestinians support Hamas. Many Palestinians in Gaza are not members of this terrorist group. They are innocent civilians who have no part in perpetuating the terror attacks. It's essential to keep in mind that many of the Palestinians are victims of Israel airstrikes, as the ongoing campaign targets the people of Gaza as much as the militants, which, in turn, is just a collective punishment that violates international law. Mr. Riley claims that Israel has taken steps to minimize collateral damage, but evidence could suggest otherwise, as we examine the catastrophic destruction of civilian areas, including hospitals and schools. We must also acknowledge that it is difficult to carry out military operations without causing some civilian casualties. The fact of the matter is, Israel cannot say for certain if their strikes are indiscriminate, thus contradicting their claims that Israel is trying to minimize these harms to civilians in the ongoing destruction of Gaza that has only escalated the humanitarian crisis, leaving over 2 million people without basic necessities such as food, clean water, and medical care. Moving on, we must acknowledge that the threat from Hezbollah and other proxy groups are a valid concern for Israel. Still, by continuing the violence in Gaza, Israel risks alienating the global community and further destabilizing the Middle East. The violence will only contribute to the exasperation of the country and also run the risk of driving suffering Palestinians into the open arms of groups like Hezbollah and Hamas. I like Mr. Riley's reference to the UN Charter and Israel's right to self-defense. Those are fair arguments. Still, it's also essential to acknowledge that it is not an absolute right to destroy an entire community in the name of security. International law is also a heavy proponent for emphasizing the importance of proper proportionality in warfare and protecting civilians. When we examine the scale of violence in Gaza, With over 20,000 Palestinian deaths, concerns are raised about Israel's adherence to the international law. So, in applying the principles of the UN Charter, we must also recognize the Palestinian right to self-determination and to be able to live with dignity and to have their sovereignty respected. Finally, the argument that Israel must continue its campaign to preserve sovereignty is made. Still, we must point out that the ongoing military actions and suffering they cause are the road to Israel's long-term security. Remember, the cycle of violence only breeds more violence and hate and carries more instability. If Israel continues this path, it risks undermining the security of its future. It also risks isolating itself from the international community and creating a generation of Palestinians who see violence as the only means of resistance. In conclusion, we have to acknowledge that Israel's right to self-defense must be respected, but it does not justify the harm that comes to civilians and cannot come at the cost of innocent lives and the violation of international law. Continuing this campaign will not bring peace or security, but only perpetuate the cycle of hate. What is truly needed in this time is a way to get a resolution through proper dialogue, diplomacy, and respect between both parties, regardless of their nationality or religion. I want to take this time to thank Mr. Jordan Riley for presenting such a strong, well-thought-out debate on this topic. And I would like to thank all of you who are watching. Thank you for your time.